It began without warning. No speeches, no countdown, no moment for people to prepare or even understand what was happening. In the early hours of June 25, 1950, as most of the Korean peninsula slept, artillery fire shattered the silence and soldiers crossed a line that should never have existed. By the time the sun rose, villages were already burning, families were running in panic, and a nation that had survived centuries of invasions and empires was once again being torn apart. This was not the beginning of hatred between Koreans. This was the consequence of decisions made far away, by people who would never hear the screams, bury the dead, or lose their children. The Korean War did not begin with ideology. It began with a line drawn on a map. For most of its history, Korea was a single, unified civilization. Long before modern borders, long before Cold War politics, the Korean people shared a language, a culture, and a deep sense of identity shaped by centuries of tradition. Families passed down stories through generations. Farmers worked the same land their ancestors had cultivated, and spiritual beliefs connected daily life to something greater than the individual. Korea was not a new nation struggling to define itself. It was an old one, deeply rooted and resilient. Yet its greatest curse was its geography. Korea sat between powerful neighbors, surrounded by empires that saw the peninsula not as a homeland, but as a strategic prize. At the turn of the 20th century, the Japanese Empire was rapidly expanding. After modernizing its military and defeating both China and Russia, Japan emerged as the dominant power in East Asia. Korea, weakened and isolated, stood directly in its path. In 1910, Japan formally annexed the Korean peninsula, erasing Korea as an independent nation. What followed was not merely occupation, but systematic destruction of identity. Korean land was seized and redistributed to Japanese settlers. Korean workers were exploited under brutal conditions. The Korean language was banned in schools, replaced by Japanese. Cultural traditions were suppressed, historical artifacts were stolen, and entire chapters of Korean history were rewritten or erased. For ordinary Koreans, daily life became a constant reminder of humiliation and fear. Resistance was punished harshly. Protests were crushed. Many were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. Women suffered some of the most horrifying abuses, forced into sexual slavery to serve the Japanese military. Entire communities lived under surveillance, knowing that even speaking their own language could bring punishment. And yet, despite decades of repression, the Korean people did not give up. Resistance movements formed both inside and outside the country. Some Koreans fled abroad, organizing opposition from exile. Others stayed and fought in secret, risking everything to preserve the idea that Korea could one day be free again. Out of this period of suffering emerged two very different visions for Korea's future. Syngman Rhee, educated in the United States, believed that Korea's survival depended on Western support and alignment with American power. Kim Il-sung, shaped by guerrilla warfare and socialist ideology, believed that only revolution could protect Korea from foreign domination. Both men saw themselves as patriots. Both believed they were acting in the best interests of their people. Neither could imagine how deeply divided the nation would soon become. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Koreans poured into the streets celebrating what they believed was finally freedom. After 35 years of occupation, the empire that had erased their nation was gone. But liberation did not bring independence. The world had changed during the Second World War, and Korea was no longer just a country seeking freedom. It had become a strategic battleground between two rising superpowers. The United States and the Soviet Union, now locked in ideological rivalry, moved quickly to secure influence. Without consulting a single Korean representative, they divided the peninsula along the 38th parallel. It was meant to be temporary, a short-term solution, a line drawn in haste, but that line would define generations. In the North, Soviet forces supported the establishment of a socialist government under Kim Il-sung. In the South, American military authorities oversaw the creation of a capitalist state aligned with U.S. interests. Almost overnight, Koreans found themselves living under foreign-backed regimes that claimed to represent them but often ruled through repression. Protests against occupation erupted across the peninsula. In the South, uprisings were violently suppressed by security forces. In the North, political opposition was eliminated by the Communist Party. Neighbors began to fear one another. Ideology replaced trust. By 1948, two separate governments declared themselves the legitimate Korea: the Republic of Korea in the South, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the North. Families were suddenly separated by a border they never chose. Parents lost contact with children. Brothers and sisters found themselves trapped on opposite sides of an invisible line guarded by soldiers. Letters stopped arriving. Visits became impossible. What had once been a single homeland became two hostile worlds. And beneath the surface, resentment and fear continued to grow. On June 25, 1950, that tension erupted into open war. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in a massive assault, rapidly overwhelming South Korean defenses. Cities fell in quick succession, and within weeks, South Korean and American forces were pushed back to a small defensive perimeter in the southeast. The situation looked hopeless, but the conflict did not remain a Korean war for long. The United States intervened under the banner of the United Nations, framing the invasion as a threat to global stability. Soon after, China entered the war, fearing that American troops advancing north could threaten its own borders. What began as a civil conflict became a proxy war between global powers. The violence that followed was relentless and unforgiving. Civilians suffered most. Villages were bombed. Refugees flooded roads, carrying what little they could salvage from destroyed homes. Massacres occurred on both sides. Prisoners were executed. Suspicion became deadly. Anyone accused of sympathizing with the enemy risked death. The Korean peninsula turned into a landscape of ruins, fear, and grief. The U.S. Air Force launched an overwhelming bombing campaign against the North, one of the most intense in modern history. Entire cities were flattened. Infrastructure essential for survival, hospitals, schools, dams, bridges, and farmland, was destroyed. By the end of the war, nearly every major city in North Korea had been reduced to rubble. An estimated 20% of the North Korean population had been killed. Survivors lived among ashes, struggling to find food, shelter, and hope. As the war dragged on, the front lines shifted back and forth, but neither side could achieve decisive victory. What remained constant was suffering. Soldiers fought in brutal conditions, facing freezing winters, scorching summers, hunger, disease, and constant fear. Many were young men barely out of adolescence, sent to fight for causes they barely understood. Letters from home became rare. Death became routine. The longer the war continued, the more meaningless it began to feel to those trapped inside it. After 3 years of relentless combat, exhaustion replaced ambition. Negotiations began, slow and frustrating, while fighting continued in the background. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. It was not a peace treaty. It did not reunite the country. It simply stopped the killing. The war officially never ended. Instead, a demilitarized zone was established along the same line that had started everything. A scar across the land, guarded by barbed wire, landmines, and soldiers on constant alert. Today, that border still exists. Families remain divided. Generations have grown up without ever seeing relatives on the other side. The war that reshaped their lives is often called the Forgotten War, overshadowed by larger global conflicts. But for Koreans, it is impossible to forget. The consequences of that war are visible every day, in politics, in military tension, in personal loss, and in an enduring sense of unfinished history. The Korean War was not inevitable. It was the result of decisions made without the consent of those who paid the highest price. It was a war born from fear, ambition, and ideology, fought on the backs of ordinary people who simply wanted to live in peace. And as long as that line remains, the war's legacy continues, not as history, but as a living wound.